combines his presentation with a learned doctor, I can assure you the sufferers are the audience. So I pity you. This presentation is a technical presentation, and therefore you have to walk with me, I have to walk with you. It's an interesting presentation because you see these issues come up every day on television. And it's extremely important, if Islam has to be relevant, that it has to provide solutions for these issues that the learned Shaykh so eloquently gave his exposition. Whenever I stand in front of the audience, I think I have got the idea, and all your small ideas, I will. And that's what happens. The big fish swallows up all the little fishes. But by the time I finish, this is what happens. All you lot finishes me. So what we want to do today is look at some of the issues pertaining to bioethics. We have to accept this fact that the battle is the battle of ideas. It is not battle in Iraq or Afghanistan. It is what happens in the mind of a young man. And everyone is after the mind of the young man. If you win the ideas of the battle, you have won the day. But you don't want to get involved with so many ideas that all the ideas burden you and you lie flat. You have to be discerning as to what ideas you want to accept. So, the presentation tonight, the aim is to raise awareness of ethics. What is ethics? To give insight as to how Islam views ethics when making law, and to offer ways in which ethics can develop in interpretation. So that's the aim, and I'm hoping that we will arrive at that when we are concluding. Just as a matter of introduction, let us see what do we understand by the term ethic. Ethics is a study of values. What makes something wrong? What makes something right? Is it a revelation? Is it custom? Is it human consensus when we have a meeting and we decide on an issue? Or is it our conscience? And when we know what right or wrong means, what rules do we apply so that we get an action? So that's what ethics in briefly is. The key division in ethics is that it is divided into two. Meta-ethics, which talks about the nature of value. In other words, what makes something good. And normative ethics, what is the correct rule for a particular circumstance? So let me explain to you. If you were to meet another person and you are having a discussion on abortion, if you say to them that I do not believe in abortion because my tradition requires me not to believe in that, that is normative ethics. But if you go beyond that and you are looking at the nature of the discussion, the nature of ethics, then you are deliberating in meta-ethics. So you're going beyond the principles. Where did the principles come from? The sources. And bioethics is the study of ethical issues and decision-making associated with living organism. And medical ethics is a branch. Let's look at some of the contemporary issues. In the 1960s, oral contraceptives were widely available. And that posed a question like this. Is it against God laws to prevent pregnancy? And for many others, the question was, would the use of contraception influence social and sexual life and undermine institution of marriage and family life? Now, at that time, there were no evidences available to us, but now there are studies which suggest that it does affect the institution of marriage. Let's look at the other issue. In December 3, 1967, there was a heart transplant carried out by Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa. And that raised immediately a problem of who determines death, what determines death. Why? Because at that time, the conception was that death involves the stopping of the heart and the stopping of the breathing. And when somebody is now taking a heart from a patient and transplanting on someone else, immediately person begins to think, well, was that guy dead? Or are they using some jiggery-pokery here? You know, if there's a rich guy who wants a heart, perhaps he might pay off someone else to get a heart from a poor person. Now, these issues were being debated. And it became a pressing matter. Up till today, it remains a challenging agenda. Why? Because as science advances, the definition of death changes. In 1950s, the definition of death was heart stopping and breathing stopping. When the ventilators were used to keep the heart going and the breathing going, people used to think, well, the patient looks dead, but the heart is going and the breathing is going. There's something odd here. By 1960s, we were doing organ transplantation, and we required biologically healthy organs. And we also did not want to kill off anyone whilst we are taking off healthy organs. And at that time, the definition of death became a brainstem death. And there was this case in New York. Somebody had clubbed a person, and that person remained unconscious. He went to the hospital, was on a respirator, and a time came when the medical experts decided that we needed to switch off the respirator, and they switched it off and the patient died. Now the matter had gone to the court, and the assailant, the one who clubbed that person, pleaded with the court that I wasn't the one who killed the patient. It was the doctor who killed the patient. Immediately there was a problem of definition. Howard Medical School came up with a definition of brain death, a non-functioning brain death. So you see, as science progressed, definition of death also progressed. In Japan, there are two definitions of death. You are given a choice. You can either have a choice to be defined death as heart and breathing stopping, or you can choose to have a definition of brain death. So this still remains a challenging agenda for us. Abortion in 1973. Roe versus Wade. There was a huge discussion. An impregnated human embryo. You know what embryo is? Yeah? No? Should I go into it? Another suffering with learned shade and a learned doctor getting together? No? Okay. An impregnated human embryo without a shadow of doubt is alive, but is embryo a person? Are we killing a person? Are we killing a human being when we remove a human embryo? When does human being come into existence? Does an assemblage of cells in the laboratory where you have egg and sperm mixed together and it's growing, is it a human being? And if we throw it away, are we throwing a person? You have to define who human being is, who a human person is. And just as a matter of interest, number of abortions per year is approximately how many? 46 million. And number of abortions per day is approximately 126,000. I'm just giving you perspective. In April 4, 1975, a lady by the name of Karen Ann Quinlan, she collapsed after swallowing sedatives and alcohol, suffered severe brain damage, given a feeding tube and put on a respirator. Her family fought through the courts for the right to remove her from the respirator and therefore end her life. Her story became familiar in the right to die debate, which still continues today. Respirator was turned off, but she kept breathing on her own and lived in a coma until 1985. Her story began an ethical discourse on when to withhold and when to terminate. Euthanasia. Euthanasia means good life, good death. Death is an event. Dying is a process. As science advances, we are extending the dying process. And in that process, there is a huge amount of problem. Patient suffering, a lot of resources used up, quality of life, all sorts of things. Dementia is another one which is coming up now. It's very important to understand dementia and death. Since 1840, every decade, every 10 years, we are extending our life by 2 years. Okay? Every decade. So today, 10,000 people are over the age of 80. 500,000 by 2070. And what they've done, they did a study, and the last decade, they found out that 2.2 years were extended. But out of 2.2 years, only 0.6 of 2.2 were healthy. 1 point something were unhealthy. So they concluded that we all will suffer 10 years of debilitation followed by dementia. You know what dementia is? Loss of memory, loss of brain cells. All right? People forget who they are. And they reckon that 30% will die, who die today will have dementia. And over the age of 95, 58% will have dementia. So although we are extending our life, but what sort of life are we extending? We are extending this type of life, a debilitating life for 10 years, followed by dementia. How are we to view the dying process? At the moment, the medical profession's job is to keep the patient alive. But when the situation is like this, debilitation for 10 years, and then dementia, would we still be viewing saving of life? Would medical profession be viewing in those terms a problem? The other thing is this one, animal-human embryonic combinations. Now, there is experimentation done. You take a sperm of an animal and an egg of a human, and you combine. Scientists tell us that they want to do research because they say that if they have a cell produced from this, then they can be used to do research. They can see processes. And that will benefit humanity, like diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cystic fibrosis, dementia. So what's the problem? Why can't we allow this thing to go on? Well, this can be the problem. We have a head of a cow, a body of a human. What sort of dignity would we give to this species? Or something like that. Or something like this. A head of a pig with all those siblings and a body of a man. There's a yuck factor, isn't it? Or something like that. And we can produce species like that who can fight for us. They'll all be in the army. They can fight for us, die for us, and that's it. Sorry? And we may think that they're not progressing, but let me read it out. They're progressing. Chinese scientists successfully fused human cells with rabbit eggs. These embryos were reportedly the first human-animal chimeras allowed to develop for several days in a laboratory. Fine, it's okay for the experimentation, isn't it? But suppose it just goes on, then produce a species like that, who will control them? In Minnesota, created pigs with human blood flowing through their bones. And at Stanford in California, they contemplated doing an experiment to create mice with human brain for research, as they believe that it would help them to cure Alzheimer's disease. And recently, of course, the UK gave permission for animal-human embryo creation. That is how, I mean, this is what UK has done. So what happens is this. You take a cell from the human body, an egg from a cow, you remove the content of the cow's egg, and you put a human content into that. And then you create stem cells, and stem cells are used for research. But what are the ethical issues? Look at it. Human dignity is one of them. What is human dignity? If we allow a monkey to have suppose we develop a monkey with a rational brain, can think just like us, would we give a dignity as we give to another human being, to that monkey? And then, of course, the identity is a huge problem. You can create organs made of animal-human combination, and you begin to put it on a human body. Suppose you do a liver with animal-human, kidney with animal-human, heart with animal-human. Eventually, you do so many organs with animal-human. Would we know that that person would be a human, or would he act like an animal? Don't know. And so people became fearful of this sort of thing. They began to ask questions, and at this moment in time, don't have any fear. Every country have refused to go down that line. They want experimentation to be done up till 14 days or 10 days, and then by law they must destroy whatever that combination is. Strict red line is drawn. But these are issues for us as well to consider. How does Islam look at ethics, particularly in these fields, in medical, bioethical fields? Firstly, Islam values ethical judgment. Why? Because we believe good actions are a hallmark of a good human being. Hence, we have akhlaq and irfan that improves one's self towards God and critically examines goodness and badness of an action. Our question is, are akhlaq and irfan important in medical ethics? Does our interpretation emphasize the concept of ethics when making value judgment? Or is it only law which determines it? Like, for example, animal-human combination, is it halal or haram? Haram. Legally, we are told it's haram, but what is the basis of it? We need to know that. So interpretation is very important. Our interpretation is very much legally and juristically focused. This is not to say that ethics is not emphasized in our interpretation, but rather we do not use it as extensively as we could. Should we? Question. And then this one. What kind of relationship should be formed between law and ethics? Really, by way of this question, perhaps I'm posing some interesting question. Now, I'm going slide by slide because you have to walk with me. It's a technical presentation, all right? By way of this question, perhaps I'm posing some interesting question. When does a moral exhortation become an obligation? When does something ethical becomes a law? What is the process involved? How does the scholar go from an exhortation, a moral exhortation, a moral suchna, or recommendation, to law? It becomes obligation now. How? How do they do it? And what are the steps taken by the Muslim scholars to move an issue from an ethical issue to a legal obligation one? So I'm posing these questions because they're interesting questions, particularly in this field now. Let's look at a couple of areas to understand why I have posed this question. And I want to look at death, the concept of death. The problem here identified is death, particularly when transplanting organs. Why? We want a healthy organs, yes, biologically healthy organs. We can't take it from a patient unless he's pronounced dead. There is paradox developing now, and we'll see how. We live in an age of transplantation of organs. I'm going to go slide by slide here. Transplantation is a product of biotechnological advances. So how does death relate to transplantation? Transplantation of human organs such as heart, liver, lung, and kidney is possible if the organ is still biologically alive so that it can be transplantable. Fair enough, we understand that. And separating the organ does not amount to injury to or death of the person. Fine, we understand that as well. Now the first meaning is clear. Transplantation is impossible when the human organ is biologically dead. Yes. But what does to imply? It is based on our value judgment. Inflicting injury to or killing a human person is morally forbidden. We would not take an organ from a person who is not dead yet. Yet we need a biologically healthy organs. If we allow the organs to remain and the patient dies for a few hours, that organ may not be good enough. So two conclusions follow from the previous premises. Separating a part or organ of the body of a person before her or his death is not allowed. Not allowed. Value judgment. Transplantation should happen sometime before biological demise of the body. That's what the science tells us. That remove the organ which are healthy so that it can be transplantable. But we cannot do that until the patient is dead. Paradox. Transplantation is only possible when the organs are alive, while at the same time no harm, injury to a live person or death of a person is allowed. That's a paradox. So we have to somehow make a person die, change our definition of death. Remember, definition of death is in our hand, and then take the organs. In order to solve the paradox, we have to determine death as occurring at a point before the complete biological end of the body. Then we could keep transplantation and death under the same roof. In other words, what we have to do is to determine death beforehand and then allow the transplantation to occur. Scientists are very clever. In this case, death is not a descriptive concept, but a normative one. We construct the definition of death as we go along. We choose the criteria upon which death is determined. That's what we have done over the years. So how are we to construct a concept of death Islamically? Let's look at some of the work that has been done. The word death and its derivative are mentioned in 143 verses of 53 different chapters of the Qur'an. I'm just going to go through it very quickly, because when a learned sheikh and a learned doctor get together, you become a sufferer. So don't want that to happen. Nor are they all used in the literal meaning of the word. But verses discussing death of human being, on the other hand, imply, now there are 4 implications there. There is a time for death determined by God. We know that from the Qur'anic ayah. It is created by God. We know that as well. Death happens to nafs, to ourself. Every soul will taste of death. It is a process through which nafs is taken. This much we know from the Qur'an. The most important point in the verse quoted is that self is taken by death. But what is the self constituted of? And how do we determine that the self is taken in the process of death? Challenge for us. Now the text is not clear as regards the nature of human self. It is also silent about a concrete criterion for determining the departure of nafs. At least we can say that nafs here refers to the characteristic feature that distinguishes human species from the other ones. That much we can say. Could this be a basis on which a normative concept, means we construct it, concept of death we built? A question to the scholars. Now, how is death determined today? The basis for death is brain death. Whenever brain death occurs to a human being, he's dead. This very criterion of brain death is a normative choice, is that we make that concept, we construct that concept. For scholars, Islamic scholars, to identify brain death, in reality, they are at the mercy of medical experts, always. They'll ask them. When you review the death in Islamic literature, this is what you get. Absence of a clear definition. In the majority, when death happens, no difficulty in its diagnosis. In few cases, usually patient in the intensive care units, there is difficulty, as Shaykh Arif expounded on it. The literature reveals human interpretation of death based on medical knowledge. The diagnosis of death has always been in the medical domain. Therefore, the medical scholars give the definition of death, and medical scholars say brainstem is a reliable indicator of death. But there is still debate amongst the Islamic scholars on the definition of death. Some of them will readily allow you to switch off the respirator. The other ones would not. So there is still a debate. So that's an area which the scholars have to work. Let's look at another area. From the use of reproductive technology, what this is that nowadays you can have a sperm from your husband and from your wife, the egg, and it can be fused in the laboratory and then implanted. That's fine. Many people don't mind that. But suppose the sperm comes from a donor who is not a husband. Then what happens? See? And some of the challenges are there. Children born outside conventional marriage arrangements. For example, people may not want to get married, but they want to create a product. So they have an egg from the girl and the sperm from the man, and they have a child. And a girl will happily say, well, I'll look after her, and that's fine. They go each way, their own way. Surrogacy, where the surrogate becomes a carrier. Suppose it is implanted into someone else who lends the womb to carry the child, who becomes the mother. What is the status of that particular person? Single parent with the aid of surrogacy has a child. Today, a single woman can have a child if she wants. And then a single gender couple through surrogacy, artificial meaning having a child. Two gender from different genders, or two same genders can have an adopted family through this means. So what does Qur'an say? The Qur'an gives this very famous ayah, and of his signs is that he created for you mates from your own selves, that you may take comfort in them, and he ordained affection and mercy between you. Here indeed are signs for people who reflect. Marriage is to achieve sukoon through mawadda and rahmah, but always with reflection. And then they look at the other ayah here, this one. They are garment for you, and you are garment for them. You discuss intimate details, you reveal intimate details between yourselves, although you are garments to each other, but underneath, you reveal those intimacy. You live in that intimacy. The souls become one. And from these two ayah, what has happened is that some key principles have been arrived at. But these are ethical principles. But look at the final one. Therefore, Islam allows use of new reproductive technology for assisted conception as long as it is done between married couples. You see, the obligation comes from those ethical principles. Some of the scholars use those two ayah to arrive at those ethical principles, and then the law. Or some scholars would look at those two ayah and say to the believing woman that they cast down their looks and guard their private parts. Now, this is a textual way of arriving a law. What are they supposed to safeguard their organs from? You see, and guard their private parts doesn't have a specification at the end. It means you guard everything. It's like if I give you an example, you guard your wealth from thieves. From thieves specifies that you guard your wealth from thieves. Suppose I say, guard your wealth only. Guard your wealth, no specification afterwards. That means you guard your wealth from everything. This is the interpretation. This is a linguistic way of interpreting something, okay? So here it says, guard their private parts. That means everything. So even if a sperm comes from a non-halal source, according to this ayah, not jaiz. But this is now a literal way of interpreting things. And that Surah Al-Mu'mineen, that verse, underpins the top one. So that's another way of giving law in Islam. And then, of course, there are lots of issues that are coming up, and all of them need answers. But what we're doing today is looking at how Islam is arriving at answers. Some of them are coming from textual interpretation, some of them are coming now from ethical principles, and some of them there is debate going on. So there are lots of questions, and we're not going to go through it, but these are the questions that have to be worked through. Conclusion. Conclusion is, what kind of ways can we expand the area of ethics in our interpretation and perhaps look at other theories to aid us in medical and bioethical decision making? Do we have to rely only on the juristic way, the legalistic way, or can we now rely upon the ethical framework, the Irfani framework, the mystic framework? And these are challenges that are there. Very briefly, let's look at the definition of ijtihad, and then I'll finish. This is a fantastic definition from Al-Muhakkik Al-Hilli. And he says that in the terminology of the jurist, ijtihad means exerting the utmost efforts in order to derive a ruling of the Sharia. Indeed, the derivation of Sharia rulings from their sources is identical with ijtihad. It's a fantastic definition. Let's just examine it a little bit more detail. Essentially, what it means is that there is an employment of effort to derive a law from its sources. What does employment mean? Employment of human intellect and effort. What does derivation mean? It's extracting something, thus showing there are layers we have to get through before obtaining law. And what are the sources? The sources are the Qur'an and Sunnah. What ijtihad does, it allows us to change or aid us in our interpretation in fiqh, ethic, etc., according to the evolution of knowledge and apply principles from the sources. So, if Islam wants to become relevant now, to answer all those issues that I have raised, it has to do it through this means. And it has to begin to use frameworks which are not just legal, but perhaps also ethical and others, irfani and mystic. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. See, I told you it's a taxing presentation, wasn't it? But at least you saw some issues that were there. You also saw how Islam is trying to arrive at conclusions of these issues. So that is important for you to know. Of course, there is question and answers, and learned Shaykh and learned whoever.